Welcome to This Week in Plymouth. I am Julie Thompson with, of course, Derek Brindisi, the Town Manager of Plymouth. Today is the 14th of December, 2022. We're almost at the end of the year.
Yeah.
And last night at the Select Board meeting, you presented the Plymouth 2024 budget proposal. So let's talk about that.
Sure. So, Julie, thanks for having me back. I feel like I haven't been here in a couple of weeks, given the holidays and stuff, and I know we'll probably take a couple more weeks off with the upcoming holidays, but this is a timely conversation, as you just mentioned. Last night, I presented to the Select Board the FY24 budget recommendation to the Select Board. So before we talk about the budget itself, just kind of talk about process, so folks at home that are listening, they understand what's going to happen in the next couple of months. So December 13th is the formal recommendation to the Select Board. The board, for the first time, heard the information. They have about 3 to 4 weeks to learn more about the budget recommendation, ask questions. You know, certainly the finance director and I will be meeting with board members individually if they want to learn more about different aspects of the budget. But then on January 3rd, the board will vote their recommendation, so they have a chance to make modifications, amendments to my recommendation. That vote will take place on January 3rd, and then that recommendation of the Select Board goes to the Administration and Finance Committee.
Okay.
A&F takes that, as you know, they break out into various subcommittees. Those subcommittees meet with all the varying departments and go through the very detailed line items of the budget, ask a lot of questions. Ultimately, when they complete their work, it's their budget, the Finance Committee's budget, that is the final recommendation to town meeting, which will take place in April. Okay.
So when you said that you presented to the Select Board and they can make recommendations, does that often happen, or do they, since you've already vetted the budget as it is, how often are big recommendations made or recommendations made that will grandly alter what you've recommended?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. It's more of a check and balance, right? So. And oftentimes when board members have questions, a lot of great questions already had come up in last night's conversation. Once they understand the rationale, the decisions, and the process behind making those decisions, they more often than not they'll agree. You know, if there's something that's very important to the board, maybe it's to meet one of their goals for the year, they may want to reinsert that back into the budget. But last night it was really talking about, this is the budget recommendation. These are the revenues that we have year over year, and these are the expenses that we're seeing year over year. And again, when you start to marry that up, it's very clear that, hey, listen, there's not a lot of flexibility in the budget to make those types of adjustments.
Right. Okay. So what was the biggest takeaways from last night?
Well, so let's talk about the budget itself. And again, and I said last night, I hope all 162 town meeting members were listening to the presentation, because it'll give them a head start on what they're going to see, in the months to come. So overall, and that's where I started, that the recommended budget is around $278 million. That's up from last year. We had a recommended budget of $268 million. So it's a 3.4% increase, which represents about $9.3 million in a recommended budget. And so oftentimes people say, well, how do we get there? And when I talk about the budget, $278 million is a lot of money, right? And it from an individual who is used to managing their monthly expenses, their mortgage and their car payment, $270 million is overwhelming. So what I try to do in my conversations is try to get folks to kind of narrow that down. That $278 million, well, the $268 million is from last year, has basically already been appropriated, already been earmarked. It's already being used to pay salaries and other fringe benefits. So let's focus on this year. And this year represents $9.3 million. And so
increase.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. So $9.3 million increase. And so the first place we need to begin is, what are our revenues coming in year over year? Because when you think of $270 million, like, well, that's a lot of money. So where are we spending our money? And so the revenues drive our ability to provide services. Right. And so last night, what I presented to the board is
And we'll put these up on the screen.
Yeah,
we'll
that's a great idea,
yep.
so folks can see that.
Yep.
So what I presented to the board was, okay, let's look at our new revenues this past year. So under Prop 2.5%, we're allowed to increase the budget and basically raise taxes by 2.5%
yep.
from the year before.
Right.
And so this past year, using that factor of 2.5%,
yep.
we have an increased revenue amount of $5.1 million, right? So that's one factor in this year's revenues.
Yep.
The other factor is this thing called new growth.
Okay.
And so this year's new growth, we're able to increase revenues by $3 million.
Is new growth guaranteed, or is that based on things have to happen?
Yes.
Okay.
So that's why we're very conservative when we think of the new growth factor, because new growth is basically, in short, it's new construction, new improvements made on people's homes,
right.
new commercial industry that's grown or industrial industry that's grown. So
which gives you more taxes.
Which helps us increase the tax base
right.
because of this quote-unquote new growth.
Okay.
So last year, for example, new growth was certified at like $5.1 million. But if we were to build that $5 million into next year's budget projection, well, what happens when new growth is certified at $4 million? That means we have a $1 million deficit.
Right, right.
So we always try to project lower than what we have historically had, because it's better to have more money in the end than less money.
Right,
and so
exactly.
we don't want to do mid-year layoffs, for example. So again, looking at the revenues, we brought in we're projecting $5 million in Prop 2.5 increase, $3 million in new growth. Then we had state aid at $1 million, which is basically a 3% increase from last year from the state, and local receipts. So local receipts are about $600,000, and that's all the fees we generate. So when people buy beach stickers, when people pull a building permit, those are all the fees. So again, looking at historical trends, $600,000. Now, one thing, if you started to add all this up, you're like, oh, that's more than $9.3 million. Well, we had to subtract $2.5 million from this $11.5 million of new revenues, because last year there was a decision that was made that we would use one-time money of free cash to help balance our budget. The problem is using this one-time money of free cash is that you already start your next budget cycle in a deficit. And so
is free cash like a savings account that you have?
So free
and you
cash
dipped into your savings account to help pay your bills?
Free cash, I would say, is more like a checking account, right? So the general stabilization, which is, we're not going to get into that conversation today, that's more like a savings. It's like a rainy day fund. Like, the sky is falling, we need money, let's go to the general stabilization account. That's our savings account. And we keep putting money in that every year because in case there's a recession someday, we want to be able to pull that money out and say, this is the only way we're going to be able to provide these services that our residents expect. So free cash is more like a checking account. There's money that's available that we typically, it's one-time money. So once you use it, it's gone. So you never want to use one-time money for a reoccurring expense.
Absolutely,
right?
correct.
So you know this as being the executive director, you would never want to do that. And so again, try to bring it down to like the average layperson like you and I. You know, we're not finance directors. It's like, do you ever try to buy a vehicle, right? You know you're gonna have a monthly car payment, and you're saying, well, I'm gonna buy this vehicle, so the first order of business, I'm going to figure out how I'm going to fill this $300 car payment every month in my monthly expenses, right? That's the right way to do it. Or some people say, I'm going to buy a car, and I'm not sure how I'm going to pay it, but I'm going to do a GoFundMe the first month and pay it, and then the next month I have my birthday coming, so I'm going to pay it that month. Eventually, you run out of ways to pay it. So that's kind of, that's a good example of like why you shouldn't really use free cash to balance your budget, because eventually you got to fill it into your reoccurring expenses. So my long story in that is that last year we used some free cash to balance it, so we had to incorporate that dollar amount into this year's budget, which is why we only had $9.3 million. So when we started the budget process, we said we have $9.3 million in new revenues. All right, now we go to the departments. We go to the school department and we say, okay, submit to us your budget.
What do you need?
Needs, right? Not wants.
What do you
needs.
need?
Right, exactly. And so when when we got the budgets back from all the different departments, it amounted to, I believe it was about $15–16 million. Mm-hmm. Remember, we only have $9 million in new revenues,
right,
but we have $16 million in expenses.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
oops.
At that point, we realized we got a problem.
Yeah.
And so that's when we started working with the departments, and we had to go through 3 rounds of cuts.
Yeah.
In order to get a balanced budget.
Right.
So there were some departments that had said, I really need this new position. Mm-hmm. You know, by getting this new position, I'll be able to do A, B, C, and D for my department. So those positions were automatically removed. Like, okay, we can't afford this. Right? So let's take those away. And then we started to look at other areas where we started to look at historical trends, like an overtime line item, like, hey, geez, we have a $2.5 million overtime line item in this budget. Historically, we spend $2 million. You know, maybe we should take a couple $100,000 out of that.
Right.
And so we went, that was kind of like round 2 of cuts.
So you're making little tiny chips out of a whole bunch of different budgets.
Right. Okay. And we did that on the school side as well. So they were sharing this, this burden as well. Ultimately, what ended up happening is we got it down to a $1.6 million deficit.
That's better.
It's better.
But it's still a deficit.
Right. So we went to the school department saying, listen, you know, we're all in this together, right? So, you know, if you guys are willing to take on $800,000, we'll go back and we'll look at our budget again and go through a 3rd round of cuts and see where we can cut out $800,000 from our budget. The budget that was presented last night is a little bit different than what the school superintendent had presented to the school committee, because before we get to that 3rd round of cuts, the school committee didn't know, the school superintendent didn't realize that we were still going to have a shortfall. So they're still working through their that $800,000.
Okay.
On our end, part of our budget presentation, we had then already worked through it, and that was part of our presentation. And that $800,000 in cuts equates to almost 10 positions that we cannot fund in FY24. So, you know, what does that really mean? What we did a few weeks back is we implemented a hiring freeze. So positions that were currently vacant, that departments wanted to go ahead and fill, we said we're going to stop hiring. The last thing we wanted to do was hire someone within any one of our departments in January and then lay that person off in July.
Right.
So the hiring freeze helps mitigate any of that.
Does it affect services?
Yes. So all of these cuts certainly will have an effect on services. And so the 10 positions, our approach was that we shouldn't expect one department to carry
the burden,
the entire burden, or even a disproportionate amount of that burden.
Right.
So we looked across all our departments and we says, listen, we're all going to share it. And you know, on the 4th floor of the town manager's office, we'll share that burden as well, right? You know, everything should start at the top. You know, so this is going to have effect on, you know, we may not be able to hire an additional police officer next year, or an additional firefighter, or you know, an additional librarian, for example. So you know, we're not saying that those people are being laid off. What we're saying is we're just not going to hire anybody, right? So you know, when the public safety departments factor in, you know, their personnel for next year, they just know that they're going to have one less body that they'll be able to hire in the course of the year.
So where you are right now is you've made the cuts, and now the school department has to make their cuts. And then you'll come back with a final. And if you still have a deficit, what do you do?
So that's a good question. That's a really good question. I didn't think you were going to ask me that question today. But
sorry.
No, it's a good one. So there are ways to remedy that. And it gets back to this notion of excess levy capacity.
Yeah, what is that? A lot of people don't understand, and it's talked about all the time. In, you know, excess levy for dummies. How would you explain it?
So excess levy capacity is it's a sum of money that's never been raised. So even that kind of is confusing. What do you mean by raised? So raising your taxes, right? So when we say we're going to raise your taxes by 2.5%, we're going to apply that 2.5% to all of our taxpayers,
Yep.
right? And that's how we raise the money.
Yep.
So over a course of time, in good years, there may have been years where the revenues outpaced the expenses.
So you didn't have to.
So you didn't have to raise that money.
But you have that kind of in a bank.
So that money that doesn't get raised, some people laugh at me because I think for the common person, to me, it's like a line of credit.
Right.
Right? So you go to the bank and you say, hey, listen, I really want to take out a line of credit against my home for $50,000. The money's sitting there to be used someday, but you don't stop paying on it until you start drawing on it.
To use it, exactly.
So for the excess levy capacity, as we headed into this year's budget, we had about $9 million of excess levy capacity. Now, kudos to Lynn Barrett, our finance director, who did a really good job over the previous 10 years of only raising the money the town needed at that time.
Absolutely.
Which created this line of credit, right?
Right.
So in order to balance this year, because it's such a tight budget year with really difficult revenues, we're in my budget recommendation, we're recommending to raise $2 million of the excess capacity in order to balance the budget.
Okay.
So when we think about people's taxes and the taxes going up, it goes up in two ways. It goes up because of 2.5% I keep talking about, and then new growth.
Right.
The third way your taxes will be compounded by going up is now dipping into this line of credit.
Okay.
So folks, if we were to draw on that $2 million, they're going to see that their taxes, that $2 million represents about $60 a year
to the
for the average taxpayer.
Okay.
So,
which is $5 a month.
Yeah. So to some people, that's not that. It's not a big lift. But I'll be honest with you, we have a very wide, diverse demographic in this community, and $60 a year is a tank of gas. It's an electric bill for the month. So, it's for folks on fixed incomes, especially our retirees, we try to balance with our budget recommendations those needs as well, right? The folks that are on fixed income. So, which is why we only recommended a $2 million excess levy capacity versus what's, in theory, we have $9 million in this.
Could actually do.
In theory, you can raise the entire thing, but we would never recommend that because we know what impact it would have on our homes. So, Julie, getting back to your original question, this is my long-winded way of answering your question. And your question was, what happens if they can't close that gap?
Right.
So, it gets back to the excess levy capacity. We'll pretend that that one of the departments still has a deficit of $500,000. Through the budget process with A&F, there could be a recommendation that says, listen, we need another $500,000 in order to maintain critical services. So instead of using $2 million of excess capacity, we're recommending $2.5 million of excess capacity. So.
And that, again, will all be voted on at town meeting.
Oh, yeah. This all. So what's great about the town of Plymouth process, it really goes through 4 different phases. It starts with the departments and the finance director and the town manager and the assistant town manager, looking at the budgets and working that through. And then it goes to the select board, and they look at the budget and they work it through. Then it goes to A&F. And then all their subcommittees, and they work it through. And, it's like making sausage. So eventually, at the end, you have a full product. And then it's town meeting. They also have the final opportunity to make any amendments to the budget on town meeting floor.
That they want to. Okay. So there's not going to be any layoffs, but there's a hiring freeze. What does that do to plans that the select board, I know, had put out for the next 5 years? There was a bunch of plans, and there was other positions in those plans. What happens with those? Yeah,
so that's a great question because, as you just pointed out, we spent a lot of time this past summer identifying some very strategic goals and priorities. And that question actually had come up with a couple different department heads saying, listen, because what we did is we took a lot of those goals and priorities and we migrated those goals and priorities in each one of the department's work plans. So each one of our department heads, they will be judged in June based upon their work plan.
Right.
Did they deliver on the goals and priorities that we all agreed upon back in August?
Right.
And so obviously there'd be some worry there that's saying, listen, like, I mean, I want to do this, but I don't have the resources any longer that I thought I had a year ago.
Exactly.
So we're mindful of that. We're going to do the best that we can with the resources that we have.
Right.
I do think that many of the goals that the board set forth in August are already well under its way.
Yep.
I do believe that in June we're going to come out with a report and talk about, you know, the dozens of accomplishments we were able to achieve. We probably won't be able to achieve them all because of what we're talking about today, but you know, we're in this for the long haul.
Right. Let me just point out one thing that really struck me watching this last night is salaries are 50% of the budget and fringe benefits are 25%. So 75% of the town's budget have to do with the people. Now, granted, a town can't run without its people, absolutely. But is there a way to create more efficiencies so less people can do more work, whether using technology or whatever other means? And are there ways to lower the costs of the fringe benefits, the health insurance, the retirement, all that?
Yeah, so I'm happy you talked about there's a slide called the Plymouth budget drivers, right, that you just, you know, reflected on.
Yeah.
And so that gets back to the conversation. When we build a budget, like a lot of folks think it's really hard to build a $278 million budget. It's actually not, because a lot of these are fixed costs.
Right.
So we know what our wages and steps and lanes are going to be,
right,
you know, for our employees. That's already built. That's, as you point out, 50% of our budget is just salaries.
Right.
Health insurance went up this past year 7%.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pension obligations went up 8%. Those are bills that we're going to have to pay, and they're already incorporated into our budget building, which is why. And then we have the other items of debt service. We have to pay our annual debt. That's another 8%. So when we look at it, we have like 84% of the budget. Before we even start the budget conversations, it's already spoken for.
Right.
Already spoken for. So, you know, then it gets into, okay, you know, what's left over? The 16%. What does that 16% of the budget really mean? Well, that's our training line item.
Yep.
That's our equipment line item. That's our fuel line item. You know, and like supplies.
Yeah.
And when you start to cut away, well, we need fuel, right?
Yeah.
You know, we need to train our people.
Yeah.
You know, fire and police, they have certain standards that they have to meet every year. So you can't cut that away. So what do you have left?
Yeah.
What are we talking about? Like not buying as much paper?
Right.
You're not going to balance a budget on pen and paper. You know what I mean? So the budget process, that's when we start to look at it like, okay, we start to look at historical trends. Okay, where's a place where historically we've not had to use all that money? But that money that is returned back at the end of the year builds our free cash. Right. So, you know, last year, if we had a certified $12 million in free cash and we just cut all those line items in all the budget, some people would call fat, which I don't agree with, but that's what some people refer to it as. That means next year we may not have $12 million in free cash, we only have $8 million in free cash. And we use our free cash to buy all of our equipment. That's a big article at our annual town meeting when we're talking about buying like a ladder truck or a 10-ton dump truck. You know, that's how we pay for that stuff.
Exactly.
You know?
What about grants or things that you get from other people? Like the Lieutenant Governor was just here yesterday.
Yes.
Can you talk about that? You have $1 million for what?
So that $1 million is going towards the Seaport Council was in town yesterday, and they awarded the town a $1 million grant to reconstruct the town boat ramp. $600,000 is appropriated at town meeting. It's a $1.5 million project. We got $1 million from the state.
Great.
So we have a grant writer. Tiffany Pack does a great job working with all the departments. We go after grants, believe me, because some people say we just have to write more grants. We go after every dollar that's out there. We're going after. And to your point, yesterday afternoon was a great example of a $1 million coming to the town. Right.
So, in the end, any budget, whether it's your household budget or a town's budget, the ins and the outs have to match.
That's right.
And when they don't, you have to find out: can I cut or can I raise more money? That's the bottom line.
That's the bottom line. And this year's a little bit more of a challenge because part of the cuts was like basically unfunding 10 positions for next year.
Right. And also there's a little bit of a lack of money that's coming into the school department. Is there not?
Yeah, one of the big problems from the school this year, you'll see they have a 4% increase.
Right, but
and Selectman Helm asked the question yesterday, how come they have a 4% increase? And they have a lot of unfunded mandates, and one of those is the special education,
right,
which, from what I've been told, like it went up by like 15%.
Exactly.
And represents over $1 million just in that one line item
Exactly.
alone.
And we have to do it. It's not like we can say, no, we're not going to participate in that.
Exactly.
And same thing with transportation.
That's right. Transportation is another budget driver on the school side.
Right, right.
So, I mean, the schools, they're in a tough spot because, they have all these unfunded mandates that they have to provide their students, but at the end of the day, it's a cost to our taxpayer.
Exactly. Exactly. So what can the average citizen do to help to keep informed, what can the average citizen do? Because a lot of people just sit there and say, well, there's nothing I can do about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in a community like this where we have representative town meeting, it's difficult for the average citizen to get more involved.
Right.
I would say, just from a citizen standpoint, we have over 50 boards and committees.
Right.
And if you want to get involved in local government and have a voice, that's the best way to do it.
Right. And also the Advisory and Finance Department is, although they're long and complex meetings, they're fascinating to watch, and you can really be educated about how does this really work? How do the dollars actually work? And it's fascinating to see that there's so many checks and balances that people don't realize exist. To your point, you're in the fourth round of looking at the budget again.
Right.
So by the time it's actually presented, it's a fine-tooth comb. You've gone through that sucker.
Yeah, no, there's so many eyes on the budget. Again, there's over 200 eyes on the budget when you add up A&F, town staff, and then 162 town meeting members. So it's a fully vetted process when it's been finalized.
Right. And one thing that want to just talk in the last couple of minutes about the new hybrid town meeting that was approved. And what that means.
Good question. So the hybrid special legislation, which was filed this past summer, has been approved, which means that the April annual town meeting, we're planning for it, working with PAC TV and others, on a hybrid town meeting, which, for our town meeting members, they can choose whether they want to go to Plymouth North High School and sit in the auditorium and participate in person, or if they want to sit in the comfort of their home and participate remotely. Up until this legislation being passed, that was not an option.
Right, they weren't allowed to. It was illegal to have a town meeting that way. And I think most people want to be part in person. They absolutely do. But there's always situations where there's an illness, or maybe you have to be out of town at the time frame of the town meeting, and you're a town meeting member. You still want to be able to participate, and this allows them to participate via Zoom, which is really, it's wonderful.
And honestly, it's for this next generation of town meeting members, in 15 years from now, it may be the only way they want to participate.
Exactly, exactly. We don't know. Time will tell. Well. We're the end of the year, so 2023 is going to be a challenge. And next week, you're going to have your last show of the year where you're going to talk a little bit about your first year and what you've accomplished and what you're looking forward to 2023.
It'll be great to do a year in review. We can get honest to see the things that we were able to accomplish.
Yeah, and lots going to happen in 2023 in the town of Plymouth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.